There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with, it's not really a review, just some thoughts. It's not a hot take. I finished the book a week ago, but I decided I don't want to organize my thoughts. It's not my style. So some thoughts on the novel Ohio by Stephen Markley. Like I say, I finished it about a week ago, and I can't get it out of my head. And I gave it 5 stars despite massive flaws. So let me just kind of walk you through that. 2018 novel. It's a debut novel by Stephen Markley. It's not his first book, but it's his first novel. It's a young guy, a little bit sexy. And the prelude is called Rick Brinklin and the Last Lonesome Night. And it was so poorly written and constructed that I almost bailed on the novel in the opening pages. It wasn't puke-worthy, but it was not that great. The scene it was trying to depict was quite compelling. A parade in a small town, New Canaan, a fictional town in Ohio, close to the present, somewhat close to the present. One of the most popular kids in high school, there's a parade in his honor months after he's been blown to bits in the war in Iraq. And that scene in the prelude was so awkwardly narrated. There was a repetitive many and a few and most of kind of rhetorical device that was so badly constructed that my eyes were glazing over. And then on page 12, references made to a bunch of the high school boys back in the day. So this is maybe about a decade after high school graduation for this constellation of high school friends and enemies. And it says, a few lived with constant subaudible guilt about what they'd gotten up to with the girl they called Nasty Tina. And that adjective, subaudible, is so awful that I have bailed on books for less. It's just the worst. Like, what the fuck does it mean, subaudible guilt? Guilt you can't hear inside yourself? Or have trouble, you're straining to hear the guilt within inside you? Like, no! However, I am so glad that I persevered past the prelude, because this ended up being a novel that touched me deeply and affected me intensely. It is about this group of about 10 high school students, and we hear the story in maybe about 4 of their voices that read almost like little novellas that interlink. And we come to deeply understand the group of 10 students, and secrets are unfurled, at least partially, to a very dramatic conclusion. I struggled with the prose throughout the book, but I wouldn't call him a terrible writer. I just think he's not a great writer, sentence by sentence. Another one that just drove me crazy because it was in the middle of a pretty good image about Lisa, who is one of the main characters. On page 184, Stacy, another main character, is reminiscing. She's thinking back to high school days with Lisa. And so the she here is Lisa. At lunch, she'd pull apart her sandwich, eat the turkey, and then scrape the mayo off with long, lascivious strokes of her tongue before throwing out the bread. That's a great sentence, but scrape? Look it up, Mr. Markley. And if you think I'm wrong, you look it up. It's just the worst possible verb for mayonnaise. Come on. Ruined an otherwise pretty great sentence, I thought. So this kind of thing wasn't on every page, but at least once every 10 pages or so I'd go, what? So I wasn't a big fan of the writing, the prose style. I also thought that there's a lot of social political observation and commentating coming through the mouths of these characters, and those mouths and those characters occasionally, or maybe a little bit more than occasionally, devolved into mouthpieces for the author's opinion, or the opinion kind of overtook and blurred the character. I don't want to make a bigger deal of that than it was, because it didn't detract to the point where, well, nothing detracted from me giving this novel 5 stars. But that's another criticism I have. I think my final criticism is it's very plotty, and that is one of its major, incredible strengths. But the conclusion of the novel, and I'm not going to say anything the slightest bit spoilery, but it was a little bit too much. And it didn't need to be as, well, I don't want to use the obvious adjectives, so I'll use a less revealing one. It didn't need to be so dramatic. I questioned, this is going to be made into an HBO series or something like that. So I faulted that on a much lesser degree than I did Gabriel Tallant's debut novel a couple years ago, My Absolute Darling, which just had this shock'em rock'em ending that was obviously designed for somebody to option the movie rights. This one, I would say it, but on a much lesser scale. It didn't need to be so dramatic. As a segue from the stuff that I didn't care for to the stuff that I absolutely loved about this novel, let me say that I freaking hate reading novels about high school, especially if I'm trapped in it. So this one wasn't trapped in high school, but even so, I hate YA. I hate anything that reminds me of my YA trauma. So the fact that this novel is centered on a group of high school kids, and we spend about half the novel in their lived high school experience, and I loved it, says a heck of a lot. I can't think of another novel about high school that I have loved. I can't think of very many novels about high school that I've finished, so kudos for that. The first character protagonist that we meet is Bill. Bill is a lefty, drug and alcohol addicted fellow down on his luck and completely full of grudges about the past. That chapter was pretty gripping. It was not boring. I was sucked in. And then the next one, and chapter doesn't quite, they're long, they're 100 pages, most of these chapters. Stacy Moore. That's probably the last name I'm going to give you. Stacy is now an out lesbian. And she is reliving her high school days and a lot of unsolved brokenheartedness and homophobia that she is processing. And I have to say, I am a big, not only fan, but proponent of coming out narratives in queer fiction, and we don't get very many of them anymore. There seem to be kind of like passé, and that pisses me off. Stacy's long chapter is one of the most heart-wrenching and compelling fictional coming-out narratives that I've ever read. It's just incredibly powerful. Wow. I loved her so much. Stephen Markley writes his characters well. I'm going to talk about what I liked, but boy, the women, he is really phenomenal at creating vividly complex female characters. So enough about chapter by chapter for now. A few of these characters have never left New Canaan, but most of them have, and coincidentally, they all kind of end up back there on the same night, about a decade after graduation. Those of them that haven't died in the war or something. And that coincidence, sometimes I balk at a fictional narrative's over-reliance on coincidences, but no. I'm a small-town girl. I think New Canaan is a much bigger small town than I grew up in, but my small town was 150 people. I don't know, I forget, this might have been 1,000 people or something. It works. It completely works. When you come from a small town, people end up, you end up meeting everybody when you go home. And it's a particular weekend, and suddenly half of your high school class is home that weekend. If it was set in New York City, it wouldn't work. It would be too overly coincidental. It's a intricately, astoundingly well-plotted novel. But what pulled me in deep was the layeredness of the characters. They were almost, and this is not a word I use lightly, almost archetypal, not stereotyped. I would argue with anybody who thought they were stereotyped. I mean, there's the class jock, and there's the brainiac, and the sexually promiscuous girl that everybody calls the slut. But no, he takes those stereotypes and he pulls you deep beneath them so that these characters live and breathe in you as you read the story. The marriage of that depth of characterization with the incredible intricacy of the plot just makes this a stunning novel in spite of all the flaws. I couldn't put it down. A week later, I can't stop thinking about it. These characters will be with me for a long time. It's so intricately plotted that, I mean, I didn't catch everything. It's one of those few times where I wanted to pick the novel up and start reading it again the same day that I finished it. It's just so rich. I liked some of the social political stuff. I mean, it was set in a particular moment in middle America. These kids are seniors in high school when September 11th happens. The way that ripples through the group and the way that politics affects their friendships, and then the wars happen, Afghanistan and Iraq, and how that ends lives and pulls people apart. Very well done. And I didn't care about all that as much as I did. It read just like a group of high school kids and the aftermath of the trauma that is high school that reminded me of my high school days in 1980s small town Saskatchewan. That's why I think it was more almost like archetypal, which is not a word I don't think I've ever used it in a booktube review, certainly not in a positive way. So yeah, this book really had a lot going on. Whether these characters have stayed in New Canaan or have left, they all have been unable to completely leave psychically, and that's one of the themes that's explored in the novel. One of the characters I won't even tell you his name, that's a villain of the piece, but a very nuanced one, reminds somebody of how this town sucks you in, keeps you doped on its own mythology. That really resonated for me. I am 53 years old, and I graduated in 1984 from high school. I'm still living those mythological archetypes of my high school class. Oh yeah, I won't tell you, Doris or Greg or Britta, who you remind me of from my high school, but you do! And this explores that in just such a powerful way. Another thing that I absolutely loved about this novel was how small details in one narrative became plot-turning huge events in another person's part of the story, and you just are always putting the pieces together. And again, I probably missed quite a few of them, but it's so well done that you just all have to be on your toes and don't discard any little minute detail as being insignificant, because it might be the thing the whole story turns on. That was so well done. So if you think you could hold your nose about some of the things that I didn't like, and if you are interested in a really powerfully threaded and structured novel about a group of high school kids and how the wounds and promise of high school is threaded throughout their young adult lives, especially if you're not the kind of person that likes that kind of story that's kind of high school centered, you must try Ohio by Stephen Markley. Thanks for watching.